Okay, it's a delight to be here. I'm going to be talking about digital art at the V&A, and I'm going to end talking very specifically about preservation. But you'll forgive me if I just begin by talking about my cover slide, which is the Cyberdata Manifesto, which Nick mentioned earlier, came into the museum as part of the Patrick Prince collection. And sometimes I just refer to this document to help me think creatively and a bit bigger about what the imagined futures could be. The manifesto, made in 1991, reads, "Interface your brain. The next stage of consciousness is coming on a global scale. Reality becomes meaningless as it fades into a techno-haze. Create your own reality. Feed your mind. The rigid sensibilities of modern society will die as the artificial inner realms grow, creating new communication forms and behavioural modes. Freedom to all data. Freedom of expression. Thinking people online are vibrating to a new frequency. Techno-harmonics, the post-New Age, hyperdelic electromediation. Create your own techno-Mandela in an astral phrase and mentally explore as pixels become nanopixels. Speech becomes colour. Thought becomes form." So, on that note, I just thought I would begin by talking, or just thinking a little bit more broadly about what virtuality is and what it could be and how it was imagined by artists in the past. And I should mention that my job very much, like Nick actually referenced, looks at some of those earlier practices by artists working with computer-generated work. So if you Google the V&A and virtual reality, these are the images that you'll most likely come across. They represent various workshops sponsored by Samsung, and you might also find some of the work that my colleague Natalie is doing with forensic architecture. So apologies if anybody's here specifically to hear about that. I'm going to be focusing very much on objects that are acquired by the collection, which is very different to commissioning a work or running a workshop or having it in a temporal space, but actually acquiring work involves a whole other set of questions to look at and think about. But that's not to say that all of the works acquired are contemporary, or the idea of creating digital or computer-generated landscapes that are imagined have been around for a long while. So I thought I'd put up a historical example. This work by Kenneth Nelson also came in via the Patrick Prince collection. I have a quote here that accompanies this work in the archive, and in a letter to the art historian Patrick Prince, Snelston, the artist, writes, "This picture was made with the use of a silicon graphic 4D 25 computer and wavefront technologies software. I hope that whoever studies this work in the future days will consider how relatively primitive were the systems we artists were working with back in the 1990s. And I think this speaks a little bit to what Saul was asking or posing the question earlier about what is it that we should acquire, and is it purely based on the aesthetic merits of something, but the idea that when something is used for the first time, the challenges that poses, and maybe the technology might not be as sophisticated as it later becomes, but I think it's important to capture it at that beginning process, otherwise we're not left with very much. Looking further back in time, I think it would be amiss of me not to also put up images of other works in the collection that really speak to this idea of creating worlds and viewing them. So as an example from the 1901 of a stereoscopic viewer. And then we jump forward to what my colleagues in DAD are collecting. I put this image up because it also represents some Oculus Rift. They also have a Samsung headgear as well. But I think you can see from this image some of the reflection, and this is part and parcel of what Tom just also talked about, the problems of collecting material that's very much displayed here as if it is just the hardware that's on display, and it doesn't really capture the essence of the piece. So display is a huge aspect of what I think about as a curator. How do we preserve it in its material form, but also what does that work do? So the museum has a history of collecting and thinking about objects as material. This is an example from the Museum of Childhood. I particularly like this piece because I went with my very young daughter to the Museum of Childhood, who walked into the glass cabinet this was in, thinking that she could play with it, but I had to explain that no, this was just the shell of the piece, and that it wasn't something that she could lay her hands on and experience as she was used to. This is changing. I'm hoping this video might work. Let's just see. Oops. Is there a check? Is there any way of facility? No. Okay. Sorry, excuse me for 2 minutes. Well, this is a video of a work by Andy Lomas. I'm afraid I don't have an image, but he also 3D printed the video viewer, and it's our virtual reality piece, one of the only ones that I've collected since joining the museum. And unlike the Oculus Rift, which is set behind a glass case, you can actually go to the Princeton Drawing Studies room and request to see this work and experience it. Alongside, at the same time, you can see prints by the artist as well. So you can see that relationship between the work that the digital images that he created on paper, and the more immersive experience that you get through putting on a headset. And it's that relationship between the two, and the cross-platform way in which the artist works that visitors to the museum are able to experience. This work's just pulled from, or this video is just pulled from YouTube, so although I can't play it here, I encourage you to take a look at his work. And Andy, also another artist connected to the Lumen Prize, looks at how nature evolves in complex forms and is algorithmically generated to create growth systems. I was also hoping that this video might automatically play, but in view of that, I shall just talk about it. Again, it's... No. So Yi Yang Kang was our Korean Samsung digital artist in residence a few years ago, and she created a work called Casting, which is a projection mapping piece. And although this isn't a virtual reality work, her practice very much thinks about creative documentation, which I think really lends many lessons to when thinking about conserving and preserving VR works. We acquired, or the museum acquired, her work in a number of formats. She used Maya and MadMapper as some of the softwares that she used, and then the piece itself was both documented and made relatively available in different file formats as a means of preserving it and hopefully keeping it and running it in different forms in the future. My last slide, again, represents some of the other born digital artworks that have been acquired by the museum. Nick mentioned the variable networks questionnaire, and these are some of the questions that we asked these artists when these works were acquired, and again, would be the same format that we would use when thinking about preserving VR works. So I'm just going to read from a list of questions that we present or have conversations with artists when acquiring the work. So we ask, what are the significant properties of the work? What is the essence of the piece that needs to be preserved, both the concept and the material components? Where is the experience? And what are we preserving and why? How would the artist like to see the work preserved in the future? And what parts are replaceable and interchangeable? In relation to the setup, we ask how it was made, what was the production path, what is the master, and we ask questions about the system and how it needs to be rebooted. We ask about install specifications, and in relation to documentation, we ask why a particular medium was used to make the work, and whether the proprietary software code was written by the artist or whether they worked collaboratively with a programmer or programmers. In relation to the physical element, we ask what is the expected lifespan before it needs replacing. If Related and in relation to the code, we ask what software the program was written on, what program it used, and how was it saved. Very importantly, we ask about recognizing problems, about what are acceptable and unacceptable changes, and when does wear and tear become detrimental change, and how do we recognize failure, for example, whether it's through colors, timing, or clarity of the drawings, if that indeed is the case. Also, the last speakers touched on, which is a really big part of what we think about, is copyright. So we discussed making copies, and what the legalities around that are, and who are the various vested parties. So the works that you see on screen are On Growth and Form by Danny Brown in the right-hand corner, a Study for a Mirror by Random International in the top left-hand corner, and a software piece by Casey Rees called Process 18 Software 3. And these are the questions that or conversations that we've had with those various artists and lend themselves as a framework moving forward. And that's my very succinct snap look at some of the digital works in the V&A's collection.